Before I get into the nitty-gritty details of the NGT story over the past 10 years, it has been an interesting process actually going back and having a think about where we've come from and how things have evolved, because I'm sure, as you can appreciate, when you're in the day-to-day hustle and bustle of constantly thinking about the next thing to do and looking forwards, there's not necessarily the time or the reason to go back and think about how things started and where they began. So this has been quite an interesting process actually to go through and give a bit more thought to that, something that I haven't done for a little while. And yeah, hopefully there's some interesting insights for you as a result of this sort of retrospective looking back. This talk is more about the way that things have happened rather than the detail of what we've done, if that makes sense, because normally when I give presentations it's talking about things we've done rather than necessarily the way that we've gone about them. So without any further ado, let's get started. Before I go into the NGT part of the story, it probably makes sense just to give you a little bit of an insight into my background, and probably the logical place to start is the latter years of my university study. I studied the swamp antechinus, which is the species there in the bottom left. So I began with a specific focus really on small mammals, and that was where my passion for the environment really started to take hold. I've just put a couple of other species there for comparison for you to get a sense of how different these small marsupials are to species that they're often commonly confused with. So there's a swamp rat there in the middle and a bush rat to the right. So yeah, I began with developing a skill set that was specialized, even though I never went on to become a dedicated mammal researcher. I did for the first few years of my professional life really, and it provided a fantastic grounding and background for many of the things that were to follow. Interestingly, one of the things that followed quite quickly for me after beginning my honours research into the swamp antechinus was the opportunity to work for the Nature Conservation Society, working on a project to help people on the land in the southeast of South Australia to fence off remnant areas of habitat for this species and the whole wide range of other important values that are associated with these near coastal wetlands where the species predominantly occurs. And that was a fantastic experience. It gave me a bit of a taste of the not-for-profit world for a short period of time, but more importantly, it just gave me a sense of how important it was to work with people and a much better understanding of the issues that were going on within the landscape itself. And it's perhaps no surprise, given some of the things that I've been involved in since, that pretty much every site I went to look for the species or to talk to people about protecting habitat was affected by artificial drainage, for instance. And it's one of the things that's really resonated with me ever since, is the need to take a step back and see the bigger picture. When you could go around and study an individual species, but unless you understand the context that it sits within in terms of its habitat requirements and landscape and land management, then you can often be missing the key ingredients for its future conservation and preservation and protection. And not long after, I managed to pick up a fantastic job as initially regional ecologist, and that eventually grew into managing a team of people working on conservation projects in the southeast region of South Australia for the South Australian government. And that's a later iteration of the team towards the end of my time there. That experience was fantastic, and I liken it to, in retrospect, I liken the 12 years I spent working in the state government to an apprenticeship of sorts, without realising it at the time. I mean, I was just turning up every day to work, wanting to do my best to try and make a difference, like everybody does. But now that I look back, I realise that there was a period of time there where just piece by piece, starting small, having a focus on an individual species, then thinking about habitat, then learning about a much wider landscape as I needed to as the regional ecologist for a region, and then thinking about what can we do about it. And as opportunities would come up, then I would just start applying for funding, and before you knew it, we built a team, and there were all these moving parts working on some really fantastic initiatives. So as well as learning about what goes on in government and how decisions are made and how to have influence, which was really important skills. Also gained exposure to project management and delivery, managing budgets and managing people. And without realizing it, like I say, I guess I was going through a form of apprenticeship that it's only become clearer to me now thinking back how valuable that time was. And it really highlights the importance of anybody out there. And if there are some younger people watching this, or people who are or who are studying, wherever you find yourself at every step along the way, you can be making sure you turn it into a learning opportunity for you to grow and to gather skills that will make you a better person and more capable of having a positive influence through the rest of your life. So and that process continues for me today. So that's just a little bit about the background, I guess, prior to 2011. 2011, things started to change for me personally in a number of ways, and some of it I think is just to do with the fact that after 12 years in one place, and despite the fact that I had learnt a lot and my role had evolved, it's just the reality of being somewhere for a long time. Looking for a new challenge, certain things will start to frustrate you as well. I mean, that's just the reality, particularly working in government. There are plenty of things to potentially frustrate people working in government, as I'm sure anyone who's worked for government who's watching can appreciate and can relate to. But yeah, the way I sort of look back on that time now is to think of it in this way. I consider that there were a number of push factors, which are things that were making me less satisfied where I was, and I'd always promised myself that if I became less happy and feeling less productive, that I wouldn't let the fact that I was a permanent government employee stop me from reconsidering what I would do next, because I have seen people in that system who become less effective because they don't feel they can move on because of the security of their job, but they're not necessarily enjoying the role. They're not necessarily bringing what they used to bring, the same enthusiasm. So I did make myself that promise, but there were other things going on at the same time as well. There was significant structural changes happening in the South Australian government at the time that were going to change the workplace around me and were changing the workplace around me, which would have meant that the way I had got used to functioning and could see was working and was successful was likely to be changed and would probably have a negative effect on that work, the things that I cared about. So that was a big motivating factor. There were also what I would call pull factors, and these are the things that you think when, well, if I'm not feeling as comfortable or satisfied or happy where I am now, what are the things that make choosing an alternative pathway desirable? And I had the fantastic experience of developing a project from scratch, which was another thing that I learnt in my old job, taking a drained and developed bit of farmland next to Piccadilly Ponds Conservation Park called Pick Swamp, and it was a 5-year process, but eventually that area was ultimately purchased by the state government thanks to a whole lot of other people becoming involved and the momentum we were able to create, and seeing it restored to wetlands. A frustration for me, and I guess it's both a pull and a push factor, was the fact that it was apparent that it was going to be very difficult to replicate what we achieved there if I stayed within the government. So a pull factor for me was the thought that, well, hey, there's so many other avenues that I could explore if I took these ideas outside of government. So that was a big pull factor, and probably no surprise some of the things that we've been doing at NGT ever since, given that that project was really foundational in my thinking about how we could go about making a difference in the landscape. Linked to that was this idea that, well, Pick Swamp was just one tiny 230 hectare property in this vast sea of modified land, and that map there shows you the original distribution of wetlands in the southeast and southwest regions of South Australia and Victoria respectively. And this is a highly modified, highly productive zone of land now because of its agricultural use and potential, but it also has this fantastic restoration potential. So the idea of being able to work across that landscape and not be hemmed in by that imaginary line that runs down the middle of it, the state border, was really attractive to me, and having personally owned bushland in Victoria near that border for a long time and working on the other side in South Australia for the government, it always frustrated me that we weren't thinking seamlessly across this artificial boundary. Of course, state government agencies have no choice. They are hemmed in by the very structures that support them and that they're created by in terms of state jurisdictions. Non-government organisations can work seamlessly across boundaries, and that was a real strong pull factor for me. In fact, I live so close to that line that I was living in Victoria and working in South Australia in the last few years of my time working for the South Australian government. And the other thing that was a big pull factor in 2011 itself, and I was starting to have second thoughts about what I should do next. The opportunity had come up to present the restoration story of Pick Swamp and Piccaninny Ponds at an international conference in the Czech Republic, and that photo is taken when we're on a field trip looking at some peatlands out of Prague in the mountainous areas nearby. That trip was a really great eye-opener by giving me the opportunity to talk to people working in a wide range of different types of organisations from across the world, and a couple that really resonated with me at the time was staff working for the Waterfowl and Wetlands Trust in the UK, and they had a consulting arm that did really great work, and it just really started the process for me thinking about, well, there are lots of different ways that organisations can be set up, and there are lots of different ways that work can get done. And it doesn't all have to revolve around government agencies. In fact, there are some things that get done easier and better if government isn't at the centre of it. And that was a bit of a revelation for me in a sense, because I had really enjoyed working for government and had sort of naively thought that the environment was government's responsibility, right? That's where it's at. I knew there were non-government organisations doing good work, but it very much felt like the government had to be at the centre of everything. My feelings on that really started to shift as a result of that trip and some of the things I learnt from people I spoke to. And I brought that thinking back home with me, which led to everything that followed. And it wasn't long after returning from that trip to Europe that sense of needing to do something and making a change was so strong that I started to chat to some of my colleagues at the time about the idea, and one by one began assembling a team. And we sort of were informally speaking before we officially formed a committee, but that process was really interesting, and I guess it's had a large effect on everything that's followed. But one of the key things that I tried to think through at the time was, who can we involve that will bring the range of skills we need to give the organisation the credibility that we require, and that bring different perspectives, and as well as having different skills, bringing different perspectives. And there are some other factors as well that you'll hear in a moment. But it was a tough time because I was managing a wider team within a government agency, and they're all fantastic people, but I was conscious that I couldn't share this idea with everybody that I worked with, and it needed to be done quietly and carefully in order to have a chance of it getting off the ground, and then ultimately, coming out and sharing it with everyone. So our original committee that you can see there is from left to right: Nick Whiterod, Becky McCann, Kath Dixon, Melissa Herpick, myself, Lachlan Farrington, and Michael Hammer. And yeah, there was an awful lot to do in that 6 months ahead of launching. Some of those things that you have to work through, obviously there's a lot of nuts and bolts in setting up an organisation that you've got to go through. Setting out your purpose is probably the most important. What are we going to exist for? So our purpose is basically 4 things, and they're descriptive, but they're also quite enabling and empowering. So habitat restoration was something that was very strong in my mind, but also a broader emphasis on protection, and wetlands being a key issue that no one else was, particularly wetland restoration didn't really have a lot of attention in this region where we began. So having a thematic point of difference was really important to me. Why do we exist? Why should a new organisation come on the scene? You have to have a reason for being that isn't already being provided by others. Science has been at the heart of everything we do. There's no accident that that group of people I showed you on the previous slide are all, even though we're all young, I think all of us were, if not all in our 30s, very close at the time. Probably makes us look a bit different as a founding group to most other organisations that begin out there. But my concern was just to be around people that I trusted and that I knew, and that we could work well together, and that we're all motivated and passionate about the idea. That was the main thing for me, is having that energy, but also having people with strong science background and strong reputation. So multiple people with PhDs, really, great operators in their respective fields. Having that ability to influence management is dependent on having that scientific credibility. And that flows on to the fact that we did want to also have the capacity to be focused on doing key research to influence conservation management, particularly of threatened species. And you wrap all of those things together, and this is one that I was really adamant about, is that we didn't want to be separate from the community. We really wanted to be part of the communities that we operate in. And so involving the community is one of our 4 key objectives outlined in our constitutional document, which in our case, because of the structure we chose, is our deed of trust. There are lots of things to think about when you're setting up an organisation from scratch, and I guess the reason this is important, and for people who are affiliated with organisations that already exist, some of these things can actually end up constraining existing organisations, depending on how they were set up at the start and what people's ideas were for what the organisation should do. We had the luxury of actually being able to decide all these things, and most people who work for an organisation out there now, whether it's a Landcare Group or another not-for-profit, someone did all of these things at some point in your history, and that's great because there was a lot of work involved, but it also means that there are things that you may not ever question or stop to think about that were laid down a long time ago, and they've actually gone on to inform the way you do business or your culture and all the rest of it. So it was a great opportunity to actually be in a position to be able to make some of these decisions, ourselves, and decide what kind of organisation we wanted to be. So in terms of business model, I was quite determined after the experience I'd had in Europe that we didn't want to be just offering one type of service or just be one type of organisation. I really like the idea that we could be a not-for-profit organisation first and foremost, but have different ways of getting that work done. So within that, 3 streams effectively of the way we could fund our work, applying for grants, offering fee-for-service services, and doing so with a professional veneer. We had the luxury of amazing guy Michael Hammer, as he was leaving the state around the time that NGT was being dreamt up and heading to a role in the Northern Territory. He had developed AquaSafe Consultants as a really trusted brand. He donated that across to NGT, and it became part of our operating model. Also brought with it that reputation and credibility, and so we were really keen to make sure that we weren't seen as just a community group. We were very conscious at the start of making sure that people understood we are science trained, we know our stuff, and if you want to work with us, we'll work with you. The catch being, in our case, that we won't just do a job for anybody, because we're a not-for-profit charitable environmental organisation. We will work on only the things that we deem are consistent with our objectives as an organisation. So there are certain types of work associated with development that we won't do. And the final one there, which initially wasn't a big factor for us, but we wanted the possibility there, was to be able to accept donations and have philanthropy be part of our model. But where we're perhaps different to other organisations and how they began is that there are other not-for-profits who only invested in the philanthropy part of the model from the beginning. And I was quite determined that we would try and do this differently. And part of that was because there was no wealthy benefactor that set us up from the beginning. We had to prove ourselves. In terms of our operating philosophy, and this is just one dimension of that, our objective was to be filling gaps. And that way you annoy people less when you're starting a new organisation. The sense that you're going to come in and take away things from others is very real, and that sense of competition was very real, and it's unfortunate, but it's human nature. We were quite determined to make it clear to people that, look, no one's doing wetland restoration. That's a gap. There's things we're already doing with AquaSave that are really well regarded. We're going to keep doing those, and we're going to keep looking for other gaps. And it means we've been different things to different people in different places. Now, those are the gaps on the ground. There are also gaps in the institutions that support what should be happening on the ground in conservation, particularly in environmental science and applied science. And that little slide there I've put up in the top right, this is another type of gap that we witnessed, and I certainly saw on a day-to-day basis previously in government that I was determined that we could try and overcome, which is who could be the glue or the grease in the wheels that holds some of these different silos together. Great work happening, but quite often the communication isn't happening or the connecting up isn't happening. So another gap that we were determined to fill was to be a mechanism by which each of those groups of people are informed by each other, so that we get the very best possible outcomes on the ground. I guess the other thing that was really important to think about was how you reduce risk, because when you're starting from something from scratch, this is a big deal. You don't want to take undue risks, and so part of that was in the representation on our committee to start with, spreading the types of expertise that we had on that group to start with, bearing in mind that it was always intended that some of those people would come and work for NGT to be part of its founding staff as well. So geographically, we spread out quite quickly, and that was deliberate by not having everybody centrally located. Now, there was challenges with that to overcome, but ironically, we sort of future-proofed NGT for COVID because we already had many of our staff working out of home offices and in remote locations. That gives us geographic reach. It also spreads risk because of that reach if you can design your systems as an organisation to support those people, which has its challenges, but on the whole, it's been great. It's worked really well. Of course, there are a million other things that I could talk about when you're setting up an organisation, but they are a few of the ones that I thought might be most insightful. And of course, then D-Day comes around, and 16th of January 2012, hitting send on an email to pretty much every person I'd ever known, and then the real work began. We were fortunate there were rounds of grants that had opened around that time that we applied for. Myself, Kath and Nick were the first 3 staff, although Nick formally didn't transition across behind the scenes until a little bit later when AquaSave was fully transitioned. But we were off and running, and despite the fact that it took a while, we really it's been busy ever since, and it was a full-on time. I guess it still is, but the idea of leaving no stone unturned to try and get this thing off the ground was really important at the beginning, particularly, and you're sort of left wondering, when will things start to happen? The first couple of months was just lots of talking to people and writing applications and just really trying to get people familiar with what it was we were trying to do and why. There's been a number of key moments over the years that I'll share just a handful with you, perhaps more in the early days. Obviously, I've just shared with you the launch date. That was a big moment for us. It took us about 2.5, 3 months to win our first tender, which was a project that Kath could work on. And when that happened, we were able to start paying her, which was fantastic. We already had existing projects for AquaSave that allowed Nick to come across as a going concern, effectively, with salary and everything in place to start with. It was a month later when we won our first major grants through this Australian Government Biodiversity Fund, and that was a real turning point for us. It really allowed us to kick off and demonstrated that we were for real. And this, that it's one thing to have an idea; it's another thing to actually have projects that can operate at scale over multiple years, and that was really what those initial grants allowed us to do. There's an element of luck here. The timing of that was outside of our control. We deliberately launched NGT at the time we did so we could apply for those grants, but we had no idea if we would get a couple of them over the line, and there hasn't really been anything like it ever since. As I mentioned earlier, about 6 months in, we fully transitioned Aquasave across into NGT's operations around the same time, actually, that my father-in-law, Richard Crew, I hope he doesn't regret it now, but he very generously at the time said, oh, you know, now that things are picking up, do you need a hand with your payroll and that side of things? And I said, yes, that would be great, because with everything else going on, keeping on top of the back of house things is a big, you know, it's a big deal. There's so many moving parts in an organisation, even when it's small. So he's been our most loyal and amazing volunteer ever since, over the last, you know, 9.5 years now, which is something I'll be forever grateful for. A year later, after 12 months into one of the major projects we got funded, we managed to set up our nursery site in the heart of Mount Gambier, which you can see the transformation of the old building there. It was at the back of the council depot at Vansittart Park. It's been our sort of central hub ever since, even though most of our staff are located remotely. It's a place we've based ourselves out of in terms of having in terms of having a presence in a regional town where people can come and volunteer and help us with things. It's a great thing for that, because most of our work is happening in remote locations otherwise. So we've been very grateful for the support of the City of Mount Gambier for making that site available and for having a relationship with us ever since. That same year, with again the 5-year program from the federal government, we started to actually get some things done on the ground with our first wetland restoration projects, and that project allowed us to bring Lachlan Farrington in as one of our senior ecologists, and he's been with us ever since, doing great work. Again, a founding committee member as well. And it was later that year we managed to secure our first reserve, which was something I wasn't sure when it would come along, but I had always hoped that our model would allow for when a site came up, thinking back to the Pick Swamp example, where the only way to resolve a land management challenge might be for a change in land tenure that would allow for restoration to occur. It would be great if we were able to step in and help fill that gap if no one else was in a position to do so. And thankfully, as a result of support from the Native Vegetation Council and Nature Foundation SA, we were able to secure our first reserve towards the end of 2013, which was a little bit quicker than I had imagined it would happen. And as you'll see, it was a few years later before we secured our second site at Mount Burst Swamp. There's another long backstory for that, which we'll go into later. But yeah, it's just been amazing ever since. The momentum that's generated from becoming active in a certain way and having irons in the fire and building connections with people has meant that things really snowballed since. So we're now up to 8 reserves, which is just amazing, and they've all got a unique story, but the themes are similar. You know, you see a gap, there's a fork in the road for a property that it could go one or of multiple directions, and we've been able to be in the right place at the right time to step in and provide an option that is going to ensure that these areas are either managed for conservation in perpetuity and or restored. And this gives me great joy to see that we've achieved this, you know, given the idea and where this began, and my passion to see us repeat what we achieved at Pick Swamp in other places. You know, to feel like we've been able to really make a difference in this way is something that, yeah, I can't express how happy I am that we've been able to achieve this. It's fantastic. So along the way, as you probably gathered from some of what I've just explained, you know, really our story is one of being flexible, dynamic, ready to evolve. These are all the things that big organisations find it hard to do. And it's been great while we've been small that we've been able to be nimble in that way. The work has evolved gradually, as you probably gathered from some of what we've spoken about. We began basically as a purely service delivery type focused organisation, whether that be through grants or contracts. And then we've become a land management organisation, and now we have a field crew, and things keep evolving and changing. We also have, particularly through our AquaSave work, a really strong research focus and a great publication record. So just depending on what the need is and how we can best contribute to our goals. We're very hard to put in a single box, and that I'm quite pleased with that. That's been quite a deliberate strategy, but it probably makes us a bit hard to understand at times from the outside when people are looking in, because we don't look or feel exactly like any other type of organisation that they might be more familiar with. Over the years, the team has really grown and changed with us, and we've had and we still have, fantastic loyal team. We've had a little bit of change here and there over the years, but largely we've got the same, core group of people that have been involved for several years, and that's great for building trust with the communities that we work with. In terms of the staff, I can't speak highly enough of the people that work for NGT, the passion they bring. My knowledge that any one of these people could go and chase more lucrative financial opportunities elsewhere, but they've remained, with us and loyal for such a long time in many cases because of the belief in the work that we're doing and the difference that it's making, which is fantastic. Our people are the biggest asset we've got, and I guess in turn for me it gives me great pleasure to see that people are so rewarded by the outcomes we're achieving and providing a genuine professional pathway. We have people occasionally make contact with us seeking to do internships, and pretty much without exception, those people all go on to win positions in other organisations and get paid work elsewhere. I guess the other part of this that's really important for me is so many jobs in the environmental sector are not on ground, they're not applied, they're not hands-on, and there's this danger that those silos we were talking about earlier, that where the jobs are isn't necessarily where people's skills are best suited, or where they want to be based on what they'd like to see occur on the ground. And I honestly believe that there is enough investment in the environmental sector, really, when you look at the number of people that are employed. But the question is, what are they all doing? And there are so many people who went through uni passionate about wanting to be involved in on-ground conservation in some form, who are now finding themselves tied up in administrative roles and in very large bureaucracies, particularly in the state government agencies and elsewhere. And it's in a sense, it's no fault of theirs. It's no fault really of the system, because this is how things evolve. But the reality is it means that not as much on-ground expertise is being developed and not as much on-ground action is happening as all of us would like to see. And I don't know how you fix this at the whole of system scale, but I am pleased to say that we're doing our bit, and we've created a haven, this melting pot for ideas and people who that's what motivates them, and they're able to grow their skills in that regard. And yes, we're small and there aren't huge development opportunities if you measure development by a career path that is measured by how much money you make, but in terms of skill development and satisfaction and feeling part of something that really matters, I'd like to think that that's the trade-off. We're ticking those boxes for people who work with us. It's not always easy, and of course we have issues like everybody does at times with staff, but on the whole, I'm really proud of the culture that we've created within NGT. And in terms of that culture, the community is a big part of this, and this has evolved and grown particularly as we've established more and more restoration sites and reserves that need looking after. So people being hands-on in our projects, sometimes also on private land, has been huge, and I can't say how grateful we are to people. It's been really nice to give them a sense of connection to our work, and also a sense of connection to on-ground outcomes by being involved in things like sandbagging and tree planting, and sometimes coming out helping us with our ecological surveys and all of those types of things. Running events and involving the community to highlight the work has been a really great way of sharing the message and providing educational opportunities as well. And I suppose in terms of the sharing, it didn't occur to me at the time when I started sending out these initially very short but little snippets of information. Initially, I think it was once a week in a short, series of blogs, newsletter. That has evolved into becoming our primary communication method with so many people, and it's great. We get feedback all the time. It gives people a sense of the work, and even though it asks a lot of our staff have a direct voice through this newsletter to people out there who like to know about the science and about what's happening, and we do our very best to explain these things in simple language, so that it's the sort of thing you could print out the story and share with your kids that are at school. And it's interesting how things, again, like everything else, it's evolved. It began very simply, and it's got to a point now where we hear regularly from many of the staff in the team, and they're sharing, good news. And I think this is really important. This idea that we're giving people hope that there are things we can do, which is really important. The decade we're now in, the decade of ecological restoration, relies on motivating people and giving them good information. So just a quick overview of how different projects have evolved from scratch, because a bit like the organisation, the things we've worked on haven't just happened. They've taken a great deal of time and thought and energy and effort. So the first example is down at Long Swamp, where, and the term I've used here is funding musical chairs. The very first project we worked on down there was a survey that was funded by the Glenelg Hopkins CMA as a contract, and that was only a small, I think it might have been a $10,000 contract. From that initial piece of work, we've managed to evolve and grow a decade-long project that's involved the community, the initially trial restoration, and then later permanent restoration works. That the site became a designated Ramsar wetland in that period. We had we provided information to support the CMA with that work. There's so many different things I could say, but this project has splintered off in multiple different directions. The community are now really satisfied with where it's ended up, which is great. That was where the project began. They raised it with us initially as a question, can we fix this wetland system? But the way we've funded it has been it's changed every 12 or 24 months, depending on what funding was available. We've gone from being either engaged as a contractor by the CMA or potentially others, but usually the CMA, to applying for grants ourselves and running them on our books that way. It's one of the benefits of this blended model we've had, is that if you're focused on the outcome you're working towards and working with your partners, then at different times it makes sense for different members of that partnership to take the lead and have the funding come through their books, but the work can continue. And this is an example of that type of approach that's been really successful. The project in the Southern Grampians that people have probably heard a lot about at Walker Swamp actually began with, from very humble beginnings. Gooseneck Swamp, again, a very small, I think it may have been a $10,000 grant that we applied for back in 2013 to put a trial structure in at that site and monitor the effects of it. Without going into the details of everything that followed, ultimately we have now restored not just Gooseneck Swamp, but also Brady Swamp downstream with the consent and cooperation of 2 neighbouring landowners. And in the course of undertaking those projects, I got to know the plantation managers next door who owned the Walker Swamp property, and ultimately, after a much longer story and another landowner in between, we managed to secure 1,000 acres next door. And the rest of that story is a presentation for another day, but the net effect is that we've been able to bring back this whole network of wetlands there across public and private land, and one of them is now one of NGT's really premier wetland reserves, which is just magnificent. That image says it all, really. And really important to keep an open mind about who you work with to get results. So we've worked with at Mount Burr Swamp. this project was sitting there. It was one of the very first sites that was brought to our attention, and I could not come up with the right way to get the finances to stack up until we heard back from an approach I'd made to 141 Plantations, who purchased the state government pines in South Australia about the same time that NGT came onto the scene. And they, after a subsequent negotiation and an evaluation by them of the private radiata pine plantations on the property, we managed to construct a deal with them where the pines on the property were forward sold, and effectively we used the funds that were brought forward by that to help us settle the purchase of the property. So we're now in a 10-15 year relationship with 141 Plantations at that site, as they look after the pines and eventually harvest them, and as those areas are removed, they'll become available to us to restore. But NGT owns the land. You know, they have a forestry agreement on the title that protects their interests, and we've managed to construct this deal that allowed us to secure the wider property. And you know, that's what it looked like before drainage, and the main swamp has been restored, but we have a long way to go. And thanks to some recent investment from the local landscape board that will be coming the way of this property, more of the 50 other wetland features on this property will start to be restored very soon. So we have some exciting times ahead. And just the value of patience and persistence. So for people who follow our news and may have heard of our most recent project at Mount Van Dyke, it may surprise you to learn that we first had a look at this property when it was last on the market back in 2012, not long after NGT had started. Now, unfortunately, we weren't quite organised enough at the time and couldn't act quickly enough to do anything about it back then, but we were very interested, and the idea it was put on the back burner. The property sold, and we thought we may never get another look at it. That's a photo there of some of our committee members at the time when we went for a wander out there when it was on the market. But patience and persistence pays off, and as people will know if they follow our news, we were able to secure the property more recently when it came back on the market, and it's now going to be a really important flagship project for us going forwards. And it just goes to show the importance of, you know, being patient, persistent, and a good idea doesn't stop being a good idea just because something comes in your path and perhaps upsets what you thought you were going to do. You know, just a matter of being patient, persistent, and hopefully circumstances will allow at some point in the future for that great idea to get back off the ground. So with, you know, runs on the board, which we were able to achieve by applying for grants and taking on fee-for-service work, all the while it took a little while to get our deductible gift recipient status. That happened for us in 2014. It's just the time that it took for processing in Canberra. And it didn't matter initially, because when you're starting from scratch and you don't have any existing donors, and none of us on our committee were connected to the philanthropic world, we were just science-trained, passionate people trying to get on with, you know, things on the ground. But it's interesting to see how once you start doing things and being non-government, these opportunities have started to open up and people have come to us. And once we got to the other side of that key date in 2014, when we had DGR status and we could actually offer people a tax deduction, it's made it possible to do some great things. One example is a wonderful local family in the Mount Gambier area, the Thompsons, who donated their wetland, the wetland portion of their property down at Hutt Bay to NGT a few years ago, and it's going to be a magnificent site for us into the future, a great demonstration site for wetland restoration. We can do that, and we can discuss those types of options with people because we have this status. So philanthropy can be in the form of land. It can also be in the form of donations towards purchases of properties, which we've done for a few of the different sites over the years now. In terms of NGT's future sustainability as an organisation, this is something that is on my mind all the time. You know, we've put so much energy and effort into getting NGT off the ground and up and running, but bearing in mind that so much of that effort has been discretionary and unpaid, and on the weekends and after hours and sitting up at night writing applications. And it's just, I'm conscious that you can't run the way you did at the start forever. And we've reached that point now where, thinking about ways, how can we set NGT up to be sustainable? Well, a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, we started the NGT Foundation, which we based on a successful model that I learned all about from talking to some really great people at the Tasmanian Land Conservancy. And this idea of having an endowment fund that will be there and generating a sustainable income stream, something that really resonated with me as a way of helping to buffer ourselves against the risk of always being working on short-term projects, which is what our existence has been to date. So yeah, thanks to several different people who have decided to chip in and start a named fund with us, as well as a whole lot of smaller donations into the general foundation. We're up to 8 different named funds in the foundation, and its balance has grown significantly. We've still got a long way to go, but we're all of a sudden on the trajectory that we hoped we would be, which is working towards a model that will build in that resilience so that the organisation and the things that we all care about that it's been achieving can be sustained, financially, which is really, really important. The passion will get you so far, but in the world we live in, with the economic system we live in, you have to have financial sustainability always in mind. In terms of where to next for NGT, well, it's been a really wild ride so far, and lots of change along the way and evolving, and I don't expect that will stop. In fact, we're hoping to usher in a period of review and change. It's happening as we speak. We've created some space within our board to allow us to bring in some new members soon. So the existing 3 members and our secretary Richard are shown there. But we're really looking forward to bringing in some new ideas and some new people that can help reflect the fact that we have changed considerably from where we began, an organisation that was an idea with $0 in the bank and really just a lot of energy and enthusiasm, to now being a multi-million-dollar outfit with lots of responsibilities and things on the go, and a need to set ourselves up for a future that looks very different to where we began. And 10 years in is an ideal time to be doing this, as we sort of create the springboard for what comes next to really set NGT up for the future. So I see this as an exciting thing. The catch is, and this is the challenge for us that I certainly talk to the other board members about, is how do we do this in such a way that we protect the things about NGT that we really value: our culture, the way of working, the collegiality, the sense of connection we have with people, the fact that we're not, we feel local to people, and we really want to protect those things because they've been really important to making us the sort of organisation we are. So yes, it's an interesting balancing act when you all of a sudden have a lot more staff than you used to, and you have to think about structure more than we used to. How do we do this change process without becoming like the big siloed organisations that we're deliberately trying to work with to help remove those barriers? So these are the challenges we face going forwards, but I'm really confident with we're getting some great input and advice from some people at the moment that are also helping inform these next steps, and we're really looking forward to what comes next. So yeah, just to wrap up, I hope this has been an interesting journey for you to hear about. It's a bit exhausting for me because the last 10 years has been a blur, and it's taken in a huge amount of time and effort and energy, and not just for me, but for the whole wide range of people that have gone in and put in over and above for us in so many ways. We're so grateful for those partnerships that we've developed with people. I hope there are some insights in here. My concern would be that no one sort of looks at this and thinks, right, we can just take that and copy it, because there are so many quirks and issues that are particular to your circumstance that I don't think this is something you can just take and copy. But I'd like to think that there's lessons throughout it that would give you some insights that if you're working for an organisation that needs to upscale or think about how it does things differently, or looking to start something, I hope there is some value in what we've been able to talk about in terms of thinking about how you can make sure that that more stuff gets done on the ground in the places that you care about, which is really what this is all about. And it's why I'm so happy to share this information with you, because this is how we make the whole sector better and actually getting, you know, more of the action done on the ground, which ultimately is what this is all about. So thanks so much for listening, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you out at an NGT reserve soon with people getting out and about more. And yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, bye.